James Brown walked into his mother's small rental house in Augusta, Georgia in 1962, carrying a check for $100,000, his first six-figure royalty payment. His mother, Susie Brown, was washing dishes in a kitchen so small you could barely turn around. The same kitchen where James had watched her cry over unpaid bills when he was a kid. The same kitchen where she'd stretched one chicken to feed 5 people for 3 days. James put the check on the table. His mother dried her hands on her apron and looked at it. Her face went pale. She sat down slowly. "James, baby, what is this?" "It's yours, Mama. I'm buying you a house. A real house, with your name on the deed. Nobody can ever take it from you." His mother started crying. Not happy crying, scared crying. "James, this is too much money. I can't take this. What if something happens? What if you need it?" James knelt down beside her chair and took her hands. And what he said next would explain everything about why he worked so hard, why he never quit, why he pushed himself to the point of collapse on stage every single night. "Mama, you spent your whole life making sure I had what I needed. Now it's my turn." To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand where James Brown came from and where his mother, Susie Brown, had struggled for most of her life. James was born in 1933 in a one-room shack in Barnwell, South Carolina. No electricity, no running water, dirt floor. His family was so poor that poor people felt sorry for them. When James was 4 years old, his parents split up. His father couldn't handle the poverty, the pressure, the hopelessness. He left, and James's mother, barely out of her teens herself, was left to raise James and his siblings alone. Susie Brown did whatever it took. She cleaned houses for white families. She picked cotton. She took in laundry. She worked multiple jobs, sometimes 16 hours a day, just to keep her children fed. But it was never enough. There were weeks when they didn't have food, nights when they didn't have heat, times when James wore shoes with holes in them because new shoes were an impossible luxury. When James was 7, his mother moved them to Augusta, Georgia, hoping for better opportunities. They ended up in a shotgun rental house on Twig Street in the poor black section of town. The house was tiny, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen so small that only one person could stand in it at a time. The roof leaked when it rained. The windows didn't seal properly, so winter wind came right through. The floorboards were so old and warped that you could see the ground underneath in some places. But it was shelter, and Susie Brown was grateful for it, even though the rent was more than she could usually afford. James remembered specific moments from that kitchen. He remembered being 9 years old, sitting at the small table doing homework by candlelight, because they couldn't afford to pay the electric bill that month. He remembered his mother standing at the stove, trying to make a meal out of almost nothing. Some rice, some beans, maybe a small piece of fatback if they were lucky. And he remembered the sound of his mother crying, late at night when she thought James was asleep. Quiet crying, trying not to wake her children. Crying because the landlord had come by demanding rent, and she didn't have it. Crying because one of her children needed shoes and she couldn't afford them. Crying because she worked so hard and it was never, ever enough. Those sounds, his mother's quiet, exhausted crying, became the soundtrack of James's childhood. And they became the fuel for everything he would later achieve. When James was old enough to work, he did. Shined shoes on the street corner for nickels, swept floors at local businesses, picked cotton alongside his mother. Anything to bring in a few extra dollars to help. But even working together, they barely scraped by. The landlord, a man named Mr. Coleman, was not sympathetic. He raised the rent twice in 5 years, and every time Susie fell behind, which was often, he'd show up at the door threatening eviction. James remembered watching through the window as his mother stood on the porch, hands clasped, begging for just one more week. "Please, Mr. Coleman, I've got work lined up. I can pay you by Friday. Please don't put us out." Sometimes Mr. Coleman would relent. Sometimes he wouldn't. There were 3 different times during James's childhood when they had to pack up their few belongings and move because they'd been evicted. Each time, they'd end up in an even worse place. Each time, James would watch his mother's shoulders sag a little more under the weight of it all. James made himself a promise during those years. He didn't tell his mother, didn't tell anyone, but he promised himself, someday, somehow, I'm going to make enough money that Mama never has to beg anyone for anything again. She'll have her own house with her name on it, and nobody will ever be able to take it from her. That promise drove James through everything that came after. When he was arrested as a teenager for stealing, spending time in juvenile detention, it was that promise that made him decide to go straight when he got out. When he started singing in local clubs for a few dollars a night, it was that promise that made him work harder than anyone else. When he formed the famous Flames and started touring, playing dive bars and small venues, it was that promise that kept him going when the money was terrible and the conditions were worse. By 1962, James Brown had been working professionally in music for about 7 years. He'd had some regional hits, Please, Please, Please in 1956, Try Me in 1958. He was known in the South, getting regular gigs, making a living. But he wasn't rich, not by any stretch. Then in early 1962, everything changed. James had recorded a live album at the Apollo Theater in Harlem the year before. His record label hadn't wanted to release it. They thought a live album wouldn't sell. But James believed in it so strongly that he'd paid for the recording himself. When the label finally agreed to release it, Live at the Apollo became a massive hit. It stayed on the charts for 66 weeks. It went to number 2 on the Billboard album chart. And suddenly, James Brown wasn't just a regional act. He was a national star. With that success came money. Real money. More money than James had ever seen in his life. When his accountant called him in May 1962 to tell him that his royalty check had arrived, $100,000, James couldn't quite process it at first. $100,000. His mother had worked her entire life and probably hadn't earned that much total in all her years of labor. James didn't buy a car, didn't buy jewelry, didn't go on a shopping spree. He went straight to the bank, deposited the check, and then went to find his mother. Susie Brown was still living in that same shotgun rental house, still cleaning houses for white families, still struggling to make ends meet, despite her son's growing success. James had been sending her money when he could, $20 here, $50 there. But Susie was proud. She didn't want to take from her son. She wanted him to save his money, invest in his career, build something stable. When James walked into that tiny kitchen in May 1962, his mother was washing dishes. She was 52 years old but looked older. Years of hard labor and stress had worn her down. Her hands were rough and calloused. Her back was bent from decades of bending over laundry tubs and scrubbing floors. "Mama?" James said, and the sound of his voice made her turn around. "James, baby, I didn't know you were coming by. Let me finish these dishes and I'll make you some." "Sit down, Mama." Something in his tone made her obey. She dried her hands on her apron and sat down at the small kitchen table. James sat across from her and pulled out the check. He'd already gone to the bank and had them write a new check. This one made out to Susie Brown for $100,000. He put it on the table. Susie looked at it, looked at the numbers, looked at her name, and all the color drained from her face. "James, baby, what is this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's yours, Mama. I'm buying you a house, a real house, with your name on the deed. Nobody can ever take it from you." Susie started crying, but they weren't the tears James had expected. They weren't happy tears, relief tears, joyful tears. They were scared tears, panicked tears. "James, this is too much money." Susie's hands were shaking. "I can't take this. This is your money. You earned this. What if something happens? What if your career doesn't last? What if you need this money later? What if..." Even in this moment, even being offered financial security for the first time in her life, Susie Brown was still trying to protect her son, still putting him first, still worried about his future more than her own present. James knelt down beside her chair. He took his mother's rough, calloused hands in his own, and he looked her directly in the eyes. "Mama, do you remember when I was 8 years old and I needed shoes for school? James's voice was thick with emotion. "And you worked 3 extra shifts that week, cleaning houses so you could buy me those shoes? Do you remember that?" Susie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Do you remember when I got arrested and you spent every penny you had on a lawyer to try to help me? Do you remember going hungry yourself so that I would have enough to eat? That's what mothers do, James. And this is what sons do. Mama." James squeezed her hands. "You spent your whole life making sure I had what I needed. You sacrificed everything, your health, your comfort, your own happiness, all so I could have a chance at something better. Well, I got that chance, and the only reason I made it is because you never gave up on me, so now it's my turn." Susie was sobbing now. "But James, this is so much money. And you deserve every penny of it. You deserve a house where the roof doesn't leak, where the heat works, where you have a kitchen big enough to move around in, where you don't have to worry about some landlord showing up and threatening to throw you out. You deserve to own something, Mama, to have something that's yours, that nobody can take from you." James stood up and pulled his mother into a hug. "Please, Mama, please let me do this for you. Not because you need me to, but because I need to. I need to know that you're safe, that you're comfortable, that you'll never have to beg anyone for anything again." Susie held on to her son and cried into his shoulder, and finally, she whispered, "Okay, baby, okay." The next week, James took his mother house shopping. He'd already talked to a realtor, told them his budget, told them what he wanted, something nice, something with a big kitchen and a yard, in a good neighborhood. The realtor showed them several houses. Each one made Susie gasp. They were so far beyond anything she'd ever imagined for herself. Houses with multiple bedrooms, with bathrooms that worked, with kitchens that had modern appliances and actual counter space. But when they walked into the house on Walton Way, a beautiful 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a wraparound porch and a big backyard, Susie stopped in the doorway and wouldn't go inside. James was confused. "Mama, what's wrong? You don't like it?" Susie was staring at the house like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "James, baby, I've lived in rental houses my whole life, places where the landlord could throw me out any time, where I couldn't paint the walls or fix things properly because it wasn't mine. And now you're telling me this could be mine?" "Yes, Mama. Yours. Your name on the deed. Your house. Nobody can ever take it from you." Susie finally stepped inside. She walked through every room slowly, touching the walls, testing the light switches, opening and closing cabinet doors. When she got to the kitchen, a bright, spacious kitchen with a window over the sink and brand new appliances, she broke down completely. "I used to dream about a kitchen like this," she whispered, "when you were little and I was trying to make dinner in that tiny space with the broken stove. I'd close my eyes and imagine a kitchen where I had room to move, room to breathe. And now?" She couldn't finish. James hugged her. "It's yours, Mama. All of it." James bought the house for $45,000, paid cash, had the deed put in his mother's name. Then he furnished it. New furniture, new appliances, new everything. He wanted his mother to walk into a home that was completely ready for her. A home where she didn't have to make do with broken second-hand things. A home that was actually hers. When moving day came, James hired movers to pack up his mother's few belongings from the rental house. Susie didn't have much, some clothes, some dishes, some photos. A lifetime of poverty meant a lifetime of not being able to accumulate possessions. But James made sure that when she walked into her new house, it was filled with everything she could possibly need. That first night in the new house, Susie called James. She was crying again, but this time they were different tears. "James, baby, I keep walking around the house turning lights on and off. Because I can. Because I don't have to worry about the electric bill. I stood in the kitchen and cooked a real meal with a stove that works properly. I took a hot bath in a bathtub that's actually clean and has good water pressure. And then I went to bed in a bedroom that's just mine, with heat that works and windows that actually seal. And I laid there thinking, this is mine, this house is mine. And I started crying, because I've never owned anything in my life, James, and now I own a house." James was crying too. "You deserve it, Mama. You deserve all of it, and more." "I know what you did, baby," Susie said softly. "I know you bought this house before you bought yourself anything. I know you're still driving that old car. I know you could have spent this money on yourself, but you chose to spend it on me, and I want you to know that promise you made to yourself when you were a little boy, watching me struggle. I know about that promise. And you kept it. You kept it, baby." James was too emotional to speak for a moment. Finally he managed. "I kept it because of you, Mama. Everything I've done, every stage I've stood on, every show I've performed, it was all for you, to keep that promise, to make sure you never had to cry yourself to sleep again, worrying about money, to make sure you'd be safe. I'm safe now, baby. Thanks to you, I'm finally safe." Susie Brown lived in that house on Walton Way for the rest of her life. She would sit on the porch and wave to neighbors. She would cook in that big kitchen. She would tend to the flowers in the yard, and she would tell anyone who'd listen about her son James, who'd grown up in poverty but never forgot where he came from, who'd made it big but never stopped taking care of his mama. Years later, when James Brown was famous worldwide, the godfather of soul, selling out arenas, making millions, people would ask him what his greatest achievement was, what he was most proud of. James would always give the same answer: buying my mama her house. Everything else, the hits, the fame, the money, that's all gravy. But keeping the promise I made to myself when I was a little boy watching her struggle, that's what matters. That's what it was all for. If this story of keeping promises, honoring the people who sacrificed for us, and using success to lift others up, moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that success means nothing if we don't use it to take care of the people who took care of us. Have you ever kept a childhood promise? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when legends proved that family comes first.